Welcome, everyone, to day 3 of the 2021 National TANF State and Tribal Directors Meeting. Time flies when you're having fun, and I want to thank all of you for participating thus far. And we hope that you've been taking advantage of the many tools and information available during the meeting, including visiting the virtual exhibit hall that's open a half an hour before and half an hour after the day. And I hope you visit our innovation station. And I want to give a shout out to Pamela McCauley. She is from MFIP DWP Program Manager, that's from Minnesota, Economic Assistance and Employment Services Division. And she submitted a Workforce One Connect app. The video is marvelous, and I hope you stop by the innovation station to view it. Also, thanks for participating in the meeting, in the community, taking and uploading pictures. Steve might have more information about the photo booth later on. Also, and scheduling brain dates with colleagues. And speaking of brain dates, due to popular demand, we have expanded the number of people who can join a scheduled brain date, including the discussion hosted by Babs Roberts entitled, "How Can Tana Support Refugees in Light of the Recent Happenings in Afghanistan," which filled up quickly. Please check the Brain Date platform on our meeting website to check for new open slots and other discussions to join as well. Today, we have another round of fantastic workshops lined up, as well as 2 plenary sessions. Today's closing plenary includes a panel of lived experience experts who will discuss how TANF work programs can build a foundation for success. To accommodate our audience and our participants, this afternoon's plenary will be conducted in the Zoom webinar format, where all participants will be muted. As you join the event from the visible agenda, you may be required to provide your email to enter the room. Also, we definitely need for you to remember to complete your session evaluation, as well as provide your valuable input. Now, yesterday, I reminded you, or I told you that we have increased our budget for our TANF learning community, and I just wanted to remind you of that leveraging America's social and economic resiliency, TLC, is open and accepting nominations. And there should be a slide on the screen now with the information. Also, tomorrow I want to remind you that we start a little early for our 12 noon Eastern Time Socialize Over Snacks. It's our second networking session for those who the afternoon was a little too late. So tomorrow we start at noon. And with that, I'd like to introduce the moderator of our first plenary session this afternoon, Susan Galanka, our Acting Director of the Office of Family Assistance. I pass it on to you, Susan.
Thank you, Lisa, and hello, everyone. As Lisa said, welcome to day 3. And I hope you all have been enjoying the opportunity to connect to your colleagues with experts and hopefully learn some new things and become inspired. So our session, our plenary today, we're calling it Talking TANF. And it's really an opportunity for folks to hear from some of our on-staff experts who are going to share their thoughts and some information about some of the sort of current issues in TANF. It's also an opportunity for you to ask them questions. Sometimes I call it Stump the Feds. But please feel free to pose your questions into the Q&A, and we will get to them after their formal remarks. So our 2 discussants, if you will, presenters and discussants today are Julie Siegel, who is our Director of the Division of State TANF Policy within the Office of Family Assistance, and Peter Germanis, who has the fairly unique title of National Expert. The 2 of them combined have over half a century of expertise in TANF, and actually even pre-TANF, but within the Office of Family Assistance. So they bring a lot of knowledge and experience and historical knowledge in particular. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie, and she will get things rolling. And as I said, please put your questions into the Q&A section. Just keep them coming, and we will be prepared to answer them. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Boy, you make me feel old, but I guess if no one else is able to talk about TANF, Peter and I certainly should be able to, and it's hard to stop Peter doing that anyway. So for today's session, what we're going to do is Peter's going to give some current national data, and then we'll get to the issues that are pressing for all of you out there. I don't know if there were any questions that came in earlier in the week, but certainly put them in the Q&A window and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We really want this to be an interactive session, as interactive as we can be in this virtual world. We will, Peter and I will be giving our best views on things, but if you need formal, official type answers to policy questions, use your standard approach of working through your regional contacts, but this will be a good heads up for us. So I will turn it over to Peter now to give us some snapshot of some current data.
Thank you, Julie. I felt a bit shortchanged in Susan's introduction. I alone have almost 40 years of experience with AFDC and TANF starting back in 1981. So Julie, you're still very young. I remember when Julie came to the Office of Family Assistance. Anyway, what I'm going to do is share some highlights from recently released reports, along with some policy implications that we may want to discuss. I'm also going to relate some of the data to a recent statement from APHSA and the TANF directors called Core Principles of TANF Modernization. I know you can't see it, but you can go to the APHSA website and download the document. It's really, worth reading. So I'm going to start with the work participation rate data we released a little over a month ago. In 2020, the national work participation rate was 39.6%, which was down from 47.1% in 2019. And this was clearly related to the pandemic, because as many of you know, when we calculate the national work rate, we do so by averaging monthly work rates. So for the first 6 months of the fiscal year 2020, the work rate was 47%. And the last 6 months, it fell to just 32%. And I know some of you in some states may think, 47%, how did we get such a high work rate at the national level? Well, a lot of that has to do with what we call token payments being made in some states, where they make small payments to people typically not associated with the cash assistance caseload. And that boosts, and as long as they're working 30 hours or more a week, they count in the work rate. So that sort of boosts that. And so those statistics are a bit misleading. So without the token payments, the work rate, the first 6 months would have been about 30%, the last 6 months about 17%. And that 30% figure has been pretty constant ever since TANF was started. And about half of it is typically unsubsidized employment, or more than half, and half is participation in other activities. And in 2020, and the data is not that different in 2019, of all the hours reported for participation, over 80% were in unsubsidized employment. There's just 7% in job search, job readiness. And as our acting assistant secretary noted Monday, only 6% was in education and training activities. And she asked, why is it that only 6% of the hours counted toward the work requirement were in education or training? And we can talk about that. Another key finding is no state failed the overall work participation rate. The main reason for that, as many of you may suspect, it's the caseload reduction credit, which gives states credit for caseload declines between a base year, which is now 2005, and a comparison year. And for the 2020 work rate, that was 2019. So 31 jurisdictions, 28 states and all 3 territories had a 0% target. And another 10 states had a target that was under 10%. And this is almost all due to caseload decline, net of eligibility changes, which don't count if they were made after the base year. Very little had to do with the provision many states were interested in called the excess MOE provision when the Deficit Reduction Act passed. That provision has changed over time and doesn't have much of an impact. So going forward, we expect very few states to be in jeopardy in fiscal year 2021, despite the pandemic and despite the fact that the comparison year is 2020, which did include the pandemic. Why? Because many states continued to have caseload declines despite the pandemic throughout 2020. And some of those that had the sort of bigger caseload increases are states that prior to the pandemic had declines of over 50%. So again, we expect very few states to sort of face real dangers in failing the work rate in 2021. That's the overall work rate. So now I want to quote from the APHSA document I referred to about TANF's work requirements. So I'm going to quote, "Families are forced to participate in ways that fulfill program rules rather than focus on their individual needs, strengths, and goals." So we can all agree that TANF has some issues, but with respect to work requirements, as Donna Pavetti mentioned in Monday's plenary session, when you have a 0% target or one that's very low, you can think more creatively about how to design your work programs to meet the needs of needy families. So over the years, we've heard a lot of concerns about the existing work rate structure, like the distinction between core and non-core activities, the 12-month limit on counting vocational education, the limits on counting job search and job readiness, the fact that there isn't partial credit for those who can't meet TANF's minimum hourly requirements, which are about 130 hours a month for many families. You now have the flexibility to design programs around these limits and still meet the work rate. So it's not really the federal law that's now holding you back. It's more like state decisions or policy decisions at the state level. And so one thing we'd like to talk to you about is how we can help you move things at the state level where these aren't concerns. Now I'm going to switch over to the spending data. This is again for fiscal year 2020. We released a pie chart about a month ago showing the national data, and there is a lot of state variation. We should have the spending data out state by state. It's on our website in about a week or two, I think. So overall, 22.2% of TANF and MOE funds were used for basic assistance in 2020. In 1996, that was 70%. So that is a sharp decline. That also explains why the take-up rate among eligible families has declined from about 80% in 1996 to 24% today. I mean, TANF as a safety net is not reaching many families with incomes low enough to qualify. Now, again, this is national data. In 14 states, the percentage devoted to basic assistance was less than 10%. In a few, it was as low as 4%. The one other thing about the spending on basic assistance I would note is that only about 10% is spent, and this is nationally, on families with a work-eligible individual, that is, those subject to work requirements. And in some states, it's as little as 2 or 3%. In fact, in a few states, the penalty for failing to meet the work requirement is more than is what is spent on behalf of families subject to the work requirement. Anyway, the core principles document states that the TANF's policy landscape has led to the diminished reach of TANF. And so there is enough funding within TANF right now to sort of reach all families that are eligible. Again, this isn't a federal law that's limiting the ability for TANF to reach all families. These are oftentimes state choices, and I realize these are not state choices by TANF directors, but often TANF in some states is seen more as a form of revenue sharing than an income support program. So beyond basic assistance, about 9.7% was used for work, education, or training. Only 0.4% was used for subsidized employment. And as Harry Holzer and others mentioned Monday, this might be a place states think about investing more funds. About 4.8% is spent on education and training, although some of this is a bit exaggerated because some of it goes to college scholarships to people who aren't on the cash assistance caseload or aren't even parents. And then about 4.5% goes to other work activities like job search, job readiness, and work experience. And 17% goes to childcare. So all in all, about 50% of TANF MOE spending is spent on what we call core welfare reform activities. Although keep in mind, because TANF is not adjusted for inflation, the size of the pie is shrinking. The last thing I wanted to quote from the core principles document, which again, I encourage you all to read, is using these core principles as a foundation, we can take a bold and systematic approach to reform that is rooted in evidence and outcomes rather than ideologies. And speaking for myself, and I'll speak for Julie too, let's do it. And now I'll turn it over to Julie.
Peter's always speaking for me. I'll say that, so that was a lot of numbers and data, and but it should give us a good picture of where TANF is at the moment. And it should also be very helpful if you did not go to Peter's quiz yesterday. You're doing another one, or the more or less the same quiz tomorrow at noon. Is that right, Peter?
Either noon or 1 o'clock, I'm not sure.
Okay. So anyway, this is good information for doing well in the quiz, and a good basis for us to talk about things. I wanted to just add a couple of words about our newest program and the first new money that we've seen in Title 4A since 2009, when we had the Recovery Act, and that is the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund, or PEAF. We had a session about it yesterday with information from New Jersey and our colleague Stan Kautstall. We had a chance to have a good discussion in a breakout session. But for those of you who need a little more information, PEAF is a $1 billion fund that goes to all states, tribes, and territories to fund what we call non-recurrent short-term benefits, or, well, they're that, non-recurrent and short-term. And those are to address needs that arise out of the pandemic. The way the law was written, it's limited to certain non-recurrent short-term benefits. Those are the ones that fit the definition in the state financial reporting form, the 196R. Basically, it cannot include things like tax credits, childcare, transportation, or short-term education and training. They're really to help, it's to serve as a a way to help low-income families who are struggling during or as a result of the pandemic. So far, just a few states and tribes have drawn down very much of the money that's put aside for them, but there's a whole year yet to spend that money. Everyone has until September 30, 2022 to spend the initial allotment. So there's time to do that. And I'm hopeful that after the session we had yesterday and the chance to hear from New Jersey, that there are lots of ideas out there and that we'll be seeing more funds drawn down and spent in PEEF. And we're happy to answer questions either now or in the future as things come up that you want to think about. So finally, I'd like to say that, given TANF has been around now for quite a while, we just had the 25th anniversary, there are several things that people have mentioned that they'd like to see changed. And Peter gave us a little list earlier of areas where we've heard that there are problems or there are obstacles built right into the law. So a few things that we've seen in legislative proposals in recent years include things like spending floors or income limits, replacing the work participation rate with an engagement or an outcome measure, or increasing the block grant in total. So those are some of the bigger picture ones, as well as the sort of things related to work in particular that Peter mentioned earlier. So right now we'd like to open it up and have a chance to answer your questions. And what we want to do is help you make changes that you need at the state level, particularly in light of what we talked about with the so many at zero or near zero targets. So I don't know quite where we are with questions. Susan, can you maybe help us out with that?
Hi, yes. Thank you, Julie and Peter. A lot of good information. And I think this issue of really understanding fully the flexibility within TANF, understanding, I think there's sometimes confusion about what is a federal rule or requirement and what is in fact a state rule or requirement or practice that could probably be changed more easily at this point than changing legislation at the federal level. But let me just say, folks, please ask questions as well as you can make comments, tell us what you're doing. All of that is welcome. I'm first going to go back a moment to some of the earlier data around and discussion around caseloads. And Peter, you talked about how the caseload actually declined generally during the pandemic. In some states it went up, in other states it went down, and sometimes it changed over the course of 2020 in particular. How might you explain the differences in how states' caseloads responded when clearly unemployment was up? What are some of the factors about a state's program that might have come into play in seeing what happened there?
Susan, I thought we agreed that Julie would get all the hard questions.
Well, I was just referencing you had it mentioned the caseload. I welcome both of you to answer.
Okay. Well, the interesting thing was shortly after, once the pandemic hit in March of 2020, caseloads actually did rise at the national level up until about June or July, and then they began to decline again. So there could be a variety of factors. I mean, as I noted, TANF in some states is maybe more a form of revenue sharing than a income support program. So a lot of the funding might, in some states, might be already redirected to other purposes, and there's limited authority to respond. It could also be that things like the expanded unemployment insurance benefits might have affected the need for basic assistance. Or it could be that some states chose to use non-recurrent short-term benefits as a way to address the immediate needs of families. So there could be a variety of factors. We did see, though, a number of states increased benefit amounts. I don't recall if any actually expanded eligibility limits a lot, but this might be something some of the people attending the conference can address as well.
Thanks, Peter. Julie, do you have?
Yeah, I'll just to build on what Peter said, the non-recurrent short-term benefits that we talked about and that PEEF is built around, those are what we often call non-assistance, which is not a term I care for, but it's outside our definition of assistance. And that means that they don't show up in what we consider the traditional TANF caseload. So yes, if grantees were offering that sort of help, we wouldn't see that reflected in the caseload. So just to explain that piece of it.
Also, I think, thank you, Julie. The Congress didn't make any changes to TANF's work rate or time limits. So I think that was also a concern some states had about increasing their basic assistance caseloads.
Okay.
Issue guidance, though, that said in FY 2020 we would apply reasonable cost to the maximum extent possible with respect to work requirements. Again, not that most states weren't even close to failing them in 2020.
But I can also imagine that in many states, individuals did not elect to come in because they might have been under the impression that they would have to meet a work participation requirement, and may not have known if in fact a state was waiving that or having different things with respect to that. You mentioned the NRSTs, and we actually have a question here. How can we obtain specific information about the use of NRST? And is all non-assistance considered an NRST?
So not all non-assistance is a non-recurrent short-term benefit, but all non-recurrent short-term benefits are a type of non-assistance. So there are other things that someone could get that are beyond the definition of assistance. But non-recurrent short-term benefits are sort of the most assistance-like benefits. They're sort of what in the AFDC days would have been emergency assistance or diversion. Those are two types of non-recurrent short-term benefits that state or tribe could offer. As to where to get more information, if you're talking specifically about the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund, we put out guidance. It's our program instruction 2021-02, and I bet someone can put the link for that in. If you want to talk more generally about non-recurrent short-term benefits in TANF, it's defined in regulation in 260.30 or 31, I forget which one, but it's in our regulations, and they're pretty readily available. And we're also happy to talk to you about the kinds of things that you want to do and how you could do that.
Thanks. And this here, another question that in some ways relates back to the caseload question or issue. If a state fails their work participation rate due to an increase in the TANF caseload, can a state claim reasonable cause if the increase was caused by removal of a policy that had previously suppressed or made it more difficult to become eligible for TANF? Can that change be calculated in the net impact of the caseload reduction credit? Shall I read that again?
Yeah.
So the issue is, with respect to the caseload reduction credit, let's say a state, in fact, experienced an increase in their TANF caseload, but they would attribute that to the removal of a policy that had caused, a reduction or a suppression in, let's say, TANF applicants and approvals. So it's sort of the opposite way we sometimes look at compensating under the
with the caseload reduction credit. States are expected to net out the impact of eligibility changes since the base year. So that would be since 2005 now. And normally, we would do a random assignment experiment to figure out what the impact of these eligibility changes are, but Congress is
Normally.
yeah, states could estimate this. And so the main thing that the credit does is states like figure out what impact did, say, a shorter time limit or full family sanctions have on the caseload, and we wouldn't count those impacts. Now, if a state makes a change that expands the caseload, and that's a change since the base year, that can be used to offset another change that caused it to decline, but otherwise it doesn't benefit the state at all.
Right, it's a caseload reduction credit. They don't get credit for increases in there. But I think, Susan, the question was, well, what if that happened and the state failed the rate as a result of removing that restriction that caused the caseload rise? So I would say a couple of things. First of all, there's hardly any states that are failing the rate. So it's not a concern in most cases. Second, if that is the cause and you think that this warrants a reasonable cause, I would say go read, make sure you understand what the reasonable cause provision is about, and make the case. Make the case to us that, you know, this warrants penalty relief, and tie it together so that we can see it. But really, I don't think there are very many. There are just a handful of states that are failing the two-parent rate, as Peter said, and I doubt that that is the reason. But I don't, if it is, and you think there's a way to grant reasonable cause, let's take a look at it.
And let me just say, there was another question that came in which relates to this, and I think largely been addressed, but how might caseload reduction credits be at odds with the desire to reach more TANF eligible families?
Well, they are at odds. The caseload reduction credit is very odd in that if a state reduces the caseload, let's say just by putting people into jobs, it's rewarded with a lower target, but at the same time, it has a lower caseload. So it should be easier to meet the targets without the credit just because they have a lower caseload. It works in the opposite direction, though, if caseloads rise. Not only do they have more cases to deal with, they may not have a caseload reduction credit. So some of the proposals we've also heard in the past would be like switching from a caseload reduction credit to an employment credit to incentivize people getting jobs.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? What it could look like? And
well, there was a lot of talk about this back in the early to mid 2000s before the Deficit Reduction Act, the only sort of major reauthorization of TANF. And that was again because caseloads declined so fast after the 96 law passed. In 2000, 31 states had a 0% target. So again, there was talk about switching away from the caseload reduction credit to giving states credit for the number of people that leave TANF that are in jobs. There were a variety of different formulas, but in general, they were designed to reduce the target from 50% to something like 30%. And in fact, I think back then there was talk of raising the overall rate to 70%. So in any event, it never got enacted. What happened instead was the Deficit Reduction Act recalibrated the base year from 1995 to 2005. So starting in 2007, many states faced a higher target.
It really wiped out the caseload reduction for quite a number of states. Which was probably the biggest effect that the deficit reduction had with respect to the work participation rate. But I just wanted to add to what Peter said on the credit. I might argue that the credits are at odds with engaging a greater percentage of potentially TANF eligible families if the only driver is the state work participation rates. If that's the only way that states and tribes, Peter and I tend to work much more with states than tribes. So, forgive us for not always connecting back in, but I think it applies, although the tribes don't have caseload reduction credits. But in any case, if the only driver is what a state has to do not to get penalized, then yes. But as Peter pointed out, 40 plus states have close to no target at all. And so they can reach out to whomever they want to provide the services. It doesn't have to be the fact that the credit is there. That doesn't have to be an obstacle, I'd say.
But I know that some people talk about the fact that TANF recipients still have individual work requirements. Is that the case? And how would that factor into being bold?
I would say that is one of the biggest myths of TANF. When the 96 law came along and, the talk was of changing welfare as we know it and making sure people do something for what they're getting. And that was sort of the talk of the time. But if you really look at what is required under the TANF law, there is no true federal individual work requirement. There is a requirement that you can find in section 402 that says that an individual must work after 24 months of receiving assistance or when work ready, whichever comes first. But what they have to do after that 24 months is work as defined by the state. So the state can make a determination about what it is. I mean, it could be that it's engaging in work activity. There could be a wide range of things. It doesn't relate to the federal work participation rate. And there's no federal enforcement of any sort of individual work requirement. That's a decision that each state makes about how they engage people. So that's within the control of states to decide, and that gives them the flexibility to go bold here in the face of lower work participation rates and to structure their programs in ways that work best for them.
And it seems that aligning with that is what Peter talked about earlier, that in fact, most of the work participation rate hours, if you will, that come from unsubsidized employment, a large percentage, right? So again, does that suggest there's also the room to engage in other activities for those folks who are not currently employed?
Yeah, in fact, when TANF was first passed, because states had low targets and many states had expanded earnings disregards, almost all of them could meet the work rates just by doing nothing or just by counting unsubsidized employment.
So there's always a lot of conversation about the work participation rate. You folks are saying it's basically, there is in fact a lot of flexibility because so many states enter the year with a zero or very nominal rate. But there's also been talk about, let's not even focus on the work participation rate. It's a process measure. It doesn't measure outcomes. I think we hear recommendations from states, from APHSA, from folks on the Hill about moving to an outcome-based measure. So what do you think about that? How could it be structured? People talk about like WIOAs. So share your thoughts on that with us, if you would.
Well, thank you, Susan. So yeah, the shortcomings of the work participation rate are well known, but switching to outcomes poses a lot of challenges as well. And many people base their proposals on the WIOA model, but it's a lot more challenging for TANF. So I'm going to summarize maybe some of the issues as, someone who might have to implement this at the federal level, things I would worry about. So one question is, who is the target group? Many of the proposals we've seen from the Hill would base outcomes on either TANF recipients or TANF leavers using some of the WIOA measures. But the problem here is in WIOA, the only people counted are people who participate in an actual employment and training activity. In TANF, most of the leavers, most of the recipients have not participated in an activity, or at least not at the time that they're leaving. So it's a little bit more challenging. Then you have to think about what outcomes do we choose? WIOA has some, but are they appropriate for TANF? Now, we're beginning to collect data and we'll be publishing some, I think, about work eligible individuals and their employment using measures similar to WIOA's, but we can't quite replicate them because of limitations in our data. Then there is the question of how should we adjust the outcomes that we collect? As many of you know, in WIOA, there's a statistical adjustment model that controls for demographic factors, economic factors. And in WIOA, when people sign up for the program, they have a detailed baseline data collection instrument that collects data on their characteristics in much more detail than what we have in TANF. We don't currently have the data to do a statistical adjustment model. So one of the things we would have to do is change our data collection methods and items that we collect data on. And this would take several years to do. Then we would need to get someone to develop a model, test it, collect the data on the outcomes. So there's a lot involved before one could switch to outcomes. Although a lot of it depends on the penalty structure. The congressional proposals we've seen would leave the existing penalty structure in place. So you want to be careful about not switching over to something completely new, different, where you have a lot of new data collection, a lot of uncertainty, and you still have a penalty. And as I mentioned before, in some states, the penalty is almost as much as is spent on behalf of the families that would be subject to this. So there are a lot of considerations in switching to outcomes. I think we really need to revisit the penalty structure and especially the penalty amounts that might be associated with failing either the WPR or outcomes. A 5% penalty that can rise to 21% was pretty significant back when TANF was enacted. But when you spend 20% or less on basic assistance, that penalty becomes huge. So there are a lot of complications. I think it's definitely something worth looking at. And I think it could be useful as a management tool in many states. And we may be doing some research in that regard. But to replace the WPR with something completely different, I think people really need to consider that carefully.
Yeah, I would agree. From talking to our colleagues at Departments of Labor and Education, getting the performance measures in place with WIOA is not been smooth sailing. And even aside from the pandemic, I think it's been a real struggle. And while they have penalties or sanctions associated with that, it's been now since 2014, and they're really just starting to get to a place where they might have a couple of reasonable performance data things to work with, but not across all the measures that they're supposed to use. And I believe they started with, they had an underlying basis. With us, it would be starting from scratch. And as Peter said, we'd be needing to collect all kinds of data that we don't collect now. It's a much larger undertaking than it sounds like when you say, let's measure outcomes, or let's reward for employment.
And I think in WIOA, as you mentioned, there is a penalty, but it's very, very small, at least compared to the TANF penalty. In fact, I've heard that the biggest penalty is federal technical assistance that has to be provided. So,
Right, thanks. Well, yes, I think the, not to dismiss the merits of the idea, but it's the execution that would take quite a bit of time. And certainly if we were to move in that direction, through statute, we would also want to engage stakeholders, such as states and tribes in that conversation.
I just want to underscore Peter's point that if that's the right direction to go, let's do it based on evidence. Let's do it not just jumping in. I mean, we have to get Congress to agree, but let's have a rational basis rather than just decide we need outcome measures.
So I know you folks are not tribal experts per se, and so I don't know if you can respond. There was a question, just a general question. What about the tribal work requirement? But do you have thoughts about that? You mentioned that the caseload reduction credit doesn't apply, and right. I think that's because tribes actually negotiate their target. But again, the issue I think around outcomes is also one that would be challenging to implement in tribal TANF. Do you want to?
Yeah, maybe even more so. And you're right, Susan, the tribes negotiate their work rate rather than having a credit. And I do think when Congress created the credit, the idea was to make the rate more reasonable, which you might think, why didn't they just make the rate more reasonable? But so there's much overlap with tribes, but there are some differences, particularly in the work area. They negotiate what the rate is that they have to meet. Many of the activities are the same, but there are some other activities like culturally relevant activities, I think, that can count for tribes that don't count for states. So those are some of the differences. I don't believe there have been very many tribal work participation penalties either. You may know more about that than I do, Susan, but my guess is that they're in at least as good, they're in as good a position as states are to be trying to offer their recipients activities that meet their needs rather than just things that will meet the work rate.
And I just want to respond a bit to Peter's talked a bit about how the work penalties seem excessive, particularly in the context of how few, if you will, adults are participating or counted in the work participation rate by nature of the caseload. I think, though, the other side we might say is, but in fact, we know that we have levied very few, if I think, complete penalties, right? States have a compliance, get corrective compliance, we can reduce it, they make some progress in all those other provisions. So I think it's really but I see the problem in being that the threat of such a large penalty is what causes states to take actions that we would say are not in the best interest, if you will, of the families we serve in terms of committing the state's dollars and effort around helping people move to work. So that's sort of my take on it. Here's a question that's a little more granular. Due to the pandemic, a lot of work activities have been delivered virtually to TANF participants. Is it allowable for a state to provide internet or tablets as a supportive service to families, TANF families, so they can participate? Or does a separate program need to be created for this service?
And I think we have answered that one previously. Yes, absolutely, a state or tribe can make a case that internet or providing tablets or other devices that connect to the internet are appropriate uses of funds so for example, an adult needs to be able to get on a remote training or education or training activity. That's that's right in there with purpose one. And so that's fine. I think the only area where we've had some issues are if we're buying tablets so that children can get on. That's a little harder to connect to TANF purpose. But if there were one for an adult, there, obviously more than one person can use a device, so or use the internet service that you pay for. So it is possible to do it, and we're happy to talk to you about the specifics.
So going back to the issue that, is there a sense that Congress is going to take action anytime soon, or do we know? Or
well, we never know, right? For sure. But, in listening to what Donna Pavetti had to say on Monday, and, the little bits that we hear here and there, it really doesn't sound like this is the year that we're going to see major reform in TANF reauthorization. But I certainly haven't heard that happening. Peter?
I would agree. There's a lot of uncertainty. We still don't know what will happen to the child tax credit, whether it will be extended. There have been several proposals in Congress that would do some of the things you highlighted before. There's the Jobs for Success Act, which the Republicans have introduced. And then there's Gwen, I think her last name is Moore, who represents the Democrats and has introduced a bill. So they all have there's some common ground, in fact, among the proposals, but there have been proposals, but we've been looking at proposals for many, many years, and there was only one major reauthorization, the Deficit Reduction Act, which in the views of some experts failed. So we're still waiting for something more positive.
When you said there was some common ground, though, what were some of those proposals then that were sort of?
Well, and I'm not sure about the Rise Up from Poverty Act, but some proposals would establish spending floors. For example, one would require states to spend 25% of TANF and MOE funds on things like basic assistance, work activities, and non-recurrent short-term benefits. And the percentages might vary and the activities might vary, but that's sort of the general theme, to ensure that states spend at least some minimum on some of the core welfare reform activities. In fact, when TANF had its 20th anniversary, Ron Haskins, who worked on the Ways and Means Committee, basically said states should be spending all of their money on basic assistance and work activities. But that was 5 years ago, and nothing has happened. Another common element is establishing an income limit, say 200% of poverty on all assistance and non-assistance. This really isn't an issue with cash assistance, since the eligibility limits are typically below the poverty line. But in some states, benefits have gone to families that have incomes well above 200% of poverty. So that's another element.
And Peter, can I just interject there? There are some places where, as you said, it's become sort of a funding stream, or things are tight in state budgets, and so legislatures and governors sometimes see the flexible TANF money as a way to, fill budget holes, or do something else in the social safety net that is laudable, if not part of TANF's core purposes. There are important things happening in child welfare and child care, and I do think those things are important, although I also think that the core purposes of TANF are also important. And, there's only so much money in TANF to go around. And if we spend it all on child welfare services, there isn't any to spend on basic assistance and employment and training services, and getting people skills so that they can maybe get good jobs and get off of TANF. So those, at least having an income limit could affect the populations that get those sorts of funds.
Right. Well, that reminds me, some of the money that in TANF has gone and supplanted existing state spending. And this was a problem that arose early on. And Nancy Johnson, who was in the House Ways and Means Committee back in 2000, sent all the governors a letter warning them not to supplant. It is perfectly legal with federal funding. But that problem has persisted. Nothing has been done about it. But anyway, getting back to the question of what other items are in proposals, it's either switching to outcomes, doing universal engagement. There are a lot of things like that. Although I think you prefaced it by saying, what is there that has common agreement? So that's mainly something about spending floors and the income limit.
What about, has there been talk about extending the 5-year limit, the time limit for cash assistance?
I haven't heard anyone mention that. And I think the TANF time limit is largely symbolic and maybe sent an important message early on. But states have the ability to set whatever time limit they want. It can be much shorter, or in effect, they can have no time limit. The problem, if they set it shorter, is it may not really address TANF's purpose one, which is adequately providing for those in need. And it also forces those states to monitor 2 time limits, because we can't stop the federal time limit. But states that don't want the federal time limit have a couple of options. One is they can use state funds to either exempt families or extend assistance. One state, in effect, takes all the families that hits the 5-year time limit and puts them in a separate state program. But states also have a 20% hardship exemption. So, and they define hardship. So they can extend assistance for that group of families beyond the 5 years. And it's not, the 20% isn't based on those subject to the time limit, but rather the entire caseload. And since half of the caseload is child only, that's not subject to the time limit at all, sort of at the national level, that hardship exemption is like 40% of the caseload. And no state, in fact, most states are nowhere near hitting the maximum. So again, here states have complete flexibility, really. It just depends on how they use their funds, what choices they make.
So here's an interesting question. Is there any appetite for us meaning TANF, getting out of the work business and shifting that responsibility to labor in a potential reauthorization? This would allow TANF to focus on income eligibility, benefit issuance, and social support services, rather than trying to focus on the work participation rate and all that goes with this.
Well, I don't know. I guess I can state my opinion on it, and it's only my opinion. I don't think that would be a good idea. We've had a long history in working with Department of Labor, and I would say, at least based on my personal context, we're doing well with working together, but DOL is not set up to, they serve such a wide range of people, and the particular needs of low income families that have barriers barriers to employment, those are not, I think it's very difficult for labor to respond well to that. And it's better to have a program at HHS where we have a history of doing that. Now, what I'd like to see, if we were to still to have a participation rate, is don't count unsubsidized employment as a work activity. That is the end goal, not the measure that you count along the way. We should be looking at how well our programs engaging people in getting the skills they need and in getting the training they need and getting the child care they need to do those things and that sort of thing, rather than once they have employment, they should come out of the rate, come out of the denominator as well as the numerator. That's sort of the way it was before TANF came along, when we had the Job Opportunity and Basic Skills Training Program, which was the employment and training piece in the AFDC days. And maybe I'm biased because I worked on that program, but I think that we have a role to play in employment and training. So, Peter.
Well, I was just going to fully agree with you. So
this kind of fell flat when I told Peter about it yesterday, but in listening to Donna on Monday talk about how work first hasn't worked well in many cases, it occurred to me that we ought to be thinking about work last. That that's the ultimate goal. We should be doing a whole bunch of things to help people, the whole TANF community, so that the last thing they get is work, and it's work that lasts. So someone else can figure out how to market that better, but that ought to be the idea, rather than, yes, there may be some people who can get a job right away and they just need a little assistance to get into that. But in looking at the caseload as a whole, that ought to be the goal, is sustainable employment that will help people not need assistance rather than just any job.
yeah, and to the extent that we do have work requirements, they should be based on evidence. A lot of the TANF stuff was based on preliminary findings from work first evaluations. And as Ron Haskins, again, one of the architects, recently said, a lot of it was just guesses. There was no evidence that states could meet a 50% work rate. None of the welfare to work experiments achieved that. There's no evidence that a 30-hour-a-week work requirement was good. But almost none of the welfare to work experiments we had such a high minimum hourly requirement. There's no evidence that the restrictions on activities, especially education and training, were the most effective approach. So, go ahead.
Peter, would it be, I think maybe it's worth mentioning that some of those restrictions that you're talking about, behavioral restrictions, may have completely missed the mark on what motivates someone who is on assistance, things like family caps and that sort of thing. Maybe the legislators or policymakers were well-intentioned, trying to create what they thought would be a functional program, but without necessarily really thinking about what motivates someone, what's going to help someone get from point A to point B.
Right. I mean, a lot of the AFDC waivers and the experiments back then, I always argue, built the political support for something like TANF, because governors hated to ask permission to do certain things. But we didn't have any evidence about the impact of time limits, full family sanctions, or the whole range of things states can do, including work requirements. So, it would be nice to rebuild a system based on evidence, which again, I think is consistent with what's in the APHSA TANF modernization document.
So I have a question here, and I think part of it, I think this is part of the discussion on the opening plenary, was that we're in a situation now where there's a lot of proposed legislation that could really impact the future of TANF. If the children's tax credit is extended or made permanent and in a targeted fashion, if we have universal pre-K, if we have, I can't remember now, I took some notes, how much money they're proposing potentially, $450 billion to go to childcare and pre-K, free community college. It seems to me all of that would really require us to rethink the purpose of TANF. But I also have another question related, somewhat related. As we evaluate the TANF program on its 25th anniversary, doesn't it seem clear that as an income maintenance program, a program that provides assistance to families in poverty to meet their basic needs, the program is a failure? Has there been discussion about ending the program and replacing it with a program that is required to reach the huge percentage of families in poverty, and to first and foremost provide real financial assistance to families.
Repeal,
So it's sort of,
replace,
pardon me?
repeal and replace.
Yeah, well, that's possibly, but I mean, sort of, how do we answer these? How do we think about this now with so much in play as well?
A national expert?
I knew it. Well, I do think that our TANF does much more than it should. Only 20% is spent on basic assistance. A lot of it is non-assistance, and often in activities that we really historically had no, within like the Office of Family Assistance, experience with. Like, why should TANF be paying for pre-K or child welfare or even child care? I mean, we have an Office of Child Care. We have an Office of Head Start. We have people who do child welfare. I mean, in many ways, to the extent that, Congress sees these as important areas, they should be funded sort of separately. I personally believe TANF should go back to its core purposes, which is basic assistance and some welfare to work activities. The problem partly also with the non-assistance is we collect almost no data on, for example, in childcare. If a family is served in CCDF, we know how much is spent, what types of childcare they're in, the characteristics of families. If TANF provides it directly, we don't have any data on any of that. I mean, it would make more sense to sort of allocate funds, as they should be. And I think part of the challenge in TANF is the addition of purposes 3 and 4 that many states have used to expand aid to things like college scholarships, which in my view, arguably don't belong in TANF. But, that would really require bold thinking. And so far, we've seen very little of that, at least coming from the Hill. There are some citizens out there, though, who do think boldly.
Here's another question. With the benefit amount so low, it's difficult to think about work last, as Julie was saying. How does the family meet their basic needs as they receive the training / skills development? I like the idea, but would have to figure that out. And I'm going to also pose that because I think the issue is it can be done, right? How can we do it within the existing structure? But I think it goes back to another issue, another question that came in quite a bit earlier, which is, let me see if I can, basically, if I can, sorry.
Well, Susan, while you're looking, I did want to mention one thing. One of the challenges also in reforming TANF is the funding structure. States are given a block grant that's based on historic AFDC funding levels. So a state like New York gets 9 times as much per child as a state like Texas. And, a lot of states fall in between. But if we want to make sure that the TANF provides an adequate minimum basic assistance amount, that it has funding for welfare to work activities, the whole funding structure needs to be re-examined, but that is a politically highly contentious issue.
Yeah, that's true.
I guess the question I was looking for is basically, how do you think, it was sort of a recognition that some of these changes, if we, even to do what, work lasts, let's just say, it would require probably legislative changes or the governor involvement. And as someone said, TANF directors are often not in direct control of making these determinations. What role can they play to sway state leaders in directions that better serve families?
Yeah, and I do think that's at the heart of this question. I mean, benefit levels are low, so increase them. And I know that the TANF directors and administrators, human service administrators may well want to do that, but face opposition from their legislature or their governors, or opposition because they don't think the budgets are there. But they're spending their TANF money in other ways. So I don't know that we can have a one answer that fits all states or all grantees on how do you engage. That's important. And maybe some of the advocacy groups that are out there, some of your representative groups can help think of what is persuasive to governors and legislatures. Some people feel that having the threat of a penalty is persuasive because nobody wants to lose money, but that has not really seemed too effective in the structure that we have now. Sometimes publishing, hey, this state only spends 2% of their money on, work activities, and yet says how important work is. So, maybe those are the sorts of things. I'm not sure that we can entirely answer that, but I agree with Peter that if we restructure and rethink how TANF is to focus on cash assistance and getting people skills, that would go a long way toward helping the program serve people better. The whole point, one point when TANF came along was to change the culture of welfare so that it wasn't just income maintenance people cutting checks without thinking about the whole person. That maybe was a successful part of TANF, that we do think about the training needs. We're more aware, again, as a whole population serving TANF families. We're aware of that. We're aware of childcare. We're aware of things in a way that we weren't before, but we're not doing a good job in connecting them to those things. And we're trying to do too many things with TANF, like pre-K and child welfare and after school activities, all of which are really good and important things. But is that the right way to spend the limited TANF dollars?
Well, let me sort of push back from a comment that was received for clients who are both TANF and social services, having childcare so that they can meet their case plan, goals, safety plan. I think by social services, they might have meant child welfare. To keep children out of care, out of home placement is important. Going back to basics and deleting this service would not help these families. The reference to childcare, Peter said,
sure,
shouldn't be funding childcare. So,
well, we didn't. I didn't mean that we should delete it. I mean, in fact, maybe we should take some of the block grant and give it to childcare. I mean, in some ways, it doesn't make sense to have childcare both in the Office of Child Care and in the Office of Family Assistance with TANF. I mean, for example, suppose Congress wants to increase funding for childcare by $1 billion and gives the CCDF that much more money. Well, that purpose could be defeated if the states that now transfer money to CCDF or spend it on childcare stop doing that. Then a lot of that $1 billion goes to funding all the array of things TANF funds. I mean, somehow, I think the only thing I was arguing is that we should make decisions about income support and welfare to work activities maybe independently of childcare. We should definitely adequately fund childcare, though.
Yeah, I agree. It wasn't a question of do we need it. We absolutely need it. Childcare is essential for our clientele to be able to go to work or work activities. But where do you fund it? We have a wonderful Office of Child Care, and that's, in my view, at least, that's where that support should come.
And I would add, who has received, did receive 39 billion, which I think must be about a tenfold, I don't know, increase in childcare spending under the American Rescue Plan, and a lot of that is stabilization, trying to get more providers back online and to support the profession of childcare.
Right, and I'd just say, and the same thing might be true about child welfare services. Those are crucial, important services, and maybe there's, states should be allowed to transfer some funds to that, but it makes more sense to operate that program by the people who know how to do that and through that funding stream rather than through TANF, where it can just end up eating away all of the TANF program.
And that question a little bit touches on something I thought about in your discussion about child welfare, is that I feel that if we had a stronger overall cash assistance program, higher benefits, reaching more people, and some wraparound supports around it, we would have fewer families having their children placed in out-of-home care. And I think really thinking about TANF as a preventative program to kids getting placed in out-of-home care, that would be a really great way to think about it, and to actually perhaps even get support for the program, more supports at the state legislature potentially. So we have a couple questions that came in quite a bit earlier about peace. So one is, what happens if funds aren't spent? Does it go back to ACF? Do the funds go back to ACF?
So if a grantee does not spend the allotment that they've received by the end of the initial allotment period, which is next year, September 30, 2022, the funds come back and we re-allot them among eligible grantees using the same formula that we distributed initially. So if a state, let's say, wasn't able to spend all of the PEEF allotment, whatever was left would come back and be redistributed among other states. If you didn't spend it all the first time, then you're not eligible to get more. But and I don't think there's going to be a large amount of money, but there will be some to be redistributed, and then they have another year plus something like that too. Is it till December of the following year to spend the second allotment?
Right. Another question was what technical assistance or support can states, territories, tribes expect to receive, if any, when administering PEEF funds? And I can answer that. I mean, we have held some webinars that are somewhere on a website, on our website or on the PRTA website. We have issued guidance, and this is sort of, and we will always continue to answer questions if folks have questions about them. We also will be providing a more robust agenda, if you will, of technical assistance in the coming year. That will be more webinars, publications, doing some quote unquote research, if you will, about how states are spending their funds, and sharing that with each other. With everyone. And I would just say, if you have questions or thoughts about how we can be most helpful, to let us know, because we definitely want to be responsive to that. And knowing that a fair amount of funds have not been spent, which is fine, because unlike some other programs, in fact, I was hearing this morning that a lot of that childcare money has to be obligated by December, and it's difficult because it's very complicated. I think the message in the session I heard yesterday about PEEF, I thought it was a good one, which was, don't overcomplicate it, so that you can get it out the door pretty quickly. But I also would say, within the time frame that we have, you can think about providing assistance now, providing help now, providing it later, perhaps, as the impact of the pandemic continues, and until we know what's happening with the children's credit, it might be good to be able to be in a position to give some funds out, some NRSTs when the children's credit potentially if it goes away. Okay, and then the other, so I have a couple comments that have come in. I think that the flexibility for a state to focus non-assistance supports based on their own state needs is one of the benefits of the block grant. States are making a choice to use TANF funds, transfer and direct TANF and childcare to ensure families can participate in work activities. Just a comment. And another comment from the same person, and I'm trying to roll it back. It was a discussion around outcomes and the notion that it's not just about, I mean, outcomes perhaps should not just be about earnings and job placement, but, you know, issues perhaps more related to progression, including around barrier removal, DV resolution, education progression, in other words, some broader measures around child and family well-being. So what do you think about that?
Well, in terms of the outcomes, I think, yeah, definitely outcomes beyond just employment entry, employment retention, earnings gain, the education related ones are useful. And we should definitely collect that. I think, you know, we need the resources to do that. We need the authority to do that, but it's something we should definitely explore.
And I did see that scroll by earlier, and I think maybe that commenter was suggesting that states could do that right now, could collect some of that, could measure themselves in some of those areas. And I think that would be great.
But we could also like evaluate it more systematically and share that information. So
yeah.
Yeah.
On the question of the flexibility in the block grant, yeah, I understand that. And I think that was the other main purpose behind creating TANF, was to create flexibility for states to decide what the needs were in where they were, and to, you know, cap what was an entitlement program so that it, you know, there was a money side of it. But sure, there's flexibility and that's great, but there aren't really any bumpers on that. And I think it would be very easy for TANF directors and social service administrators to find that the funds they had to craft the program that they wanted, to spend childcare how they wanted, can slip away because there are priorities from the legislature or from a governor, and you know, that might be somewhat more peripheral to the core parts of TANF. And I agree, childcare is certainly central.
So we had a question about, are there any handouts to share with folks' coworkers? And I'm thinking maybe referencing some of the things on our website that.
Yeah, I mean, Peter walked through a lot of data, and there are pie charts, there are national ones, and there are state-specific ones on our website. There are, I'm just being reminded that the session's being recorded, so that could be shared at a future time. So those are things, we have guidance there. We have, let's see, what else might be a good resource?
Well, I think one thing was posted in the chat to folks was the webinar on the PEEF.
The one we did back in the spring, or we actually did a series. We did a state one, we did a tribal one, and I think we did a separate one. So.
Yeah, we have lots of resources. It just takes a little patience to navigate our website, but
and if you let your regional contacts know what kind of resources you want to share, you know, we'll get right on that.
And I'm just going to sort of paraphrase a comment here, and I think it's important. I think it's in reference to the fact that tribal TANF has doesn't have the data available the way state TANF does, or the infrastructure really to even collect it. And we acknowledge that. We are trying to, we're actually have a whole initiative underway that relates to how both states and tribes in the future would submit their TANF data. We're creating a TANF data portal, which we hope will make it easier for states and tribes in terms of submitting their data, but also perhaps on their end, being able to, collect it as well. We're not intending to require any additional data to be submitted, because in fact, we don't have the authority to ask that, but we really hope to make the system easier for you all to access, and easier to access your data and use it once you've submitted it. So, okay. So here's one.
I just wanted to say I really miss being able to interact directly and hear everybody. But appreciate everybody sending in lots of. It sounds like you got another one, Susan.
Julie, I'm surprised to hear you say that, because when we went on the rollout for the Deficit Reduction Act, I remember Susan Galanka.
I'm going to mute you.
Challenging questions and putting us on the spot. I like this format better.
And that was in a prior life of mine. So it sounds like there's a lot of potential for change via state TANF program engagement with state governors and legislators. What potential technical assistance could be forthcoming to help states think through strategies tailored to their needs? We will take that question and ponder it, but I think that's clearly something we can help with. I mean, it sounds like it's two parts. How do you communicate to policymakers, but also how does the state figure out really what they might want to be doing, and what flexibilities they might take advantage of, what policies and practices in place they might want to change. And now that you put it out there, we'll give it some thought. I could see definitely some sort of a community of learning, having exchanges among each other about doing that.
And talk to us too, if there are things that you think would be helpful, or things you want help thinking about. We'd love to engage with you on that.
Right. And in fact, again, and a lot of this goes to the fact that you probably do have much more flexibility than you were using. We did, I remember, consult with a state who was asking for, I think basically they were hoping they could get a waiver when we didn't actually have that capacity. But as we went through what they wanted to do, we were like, you can do that already. You can do that already. You can do that already. So it ended up that they actually implemented a whole new initiative based on the flexibilities that currently existed. So.
Hi, Susan. This is Lisa. I wanted to also suggest that there's no wrong door for asking for peer TA. They can request TA through the peer TA network, through their RPM, or for calling us directly, so that we have that capability of providing resources to a state and providing coaching as they want to facilitate their changes.
Thank you, Lisa. That's absolutely right. We try to be as responsive as possible and give you various avenues for to request technical assistance, and we're happy to do so. So we have, I think, 2 minutes left. Peter and Julie, any last things you want to get off your chest that you weren't able to say, that you haven't said yet? And Peter, I'm only talking about a minute.
Well, in that case, I defer to Julie.
I was gonna yield the gentleman my minute, but and I mean, I think it's a partnership, and we want to be partners with all the states and tribes and territories out there to try to do a better job. If there are places that there are federal rules that are in your way, let's see what that is and see what we can do. And if it's that you're not sure, let's talk about it and see if it's a state rule that's in your way and what we could do about that.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you everyone who joined us this afternoon. Peter and Julie, as usual, you were put to the test and you did great. And
Now everyone can go to Peter's test. Peter's
yes, if folks, yes, there is for the right tomorrow. It's at noon. There is a TANF quiz and
noon Eastern.
So folks, Eastern, I encourage you to participate in that. That is a fun thing. But, we also recognize that many of you certainly wish that there was more money being spent on cash, that you had more money to spend on employment and training, that a lot of those decisions are made elsewhere. And in that context, we certainly appreciate the commitment that each and every one of you has toward families and helping them achieve greater economic security. So I want to thank everyone again for joining us. I think there's about a 15-minute break. Is that right, Steve? And then folks go into the next session. So there's some great concurrent sessions this afternoon. And, we look forward to seeing you. And I just got a reminder, it's not only that we are helping states work these things out, we work with tribes, we work with territories. We want to help everybody do as best they can with what they have. Oh, it's a 30-minute break, actually. Okay. That's
well, and thanks to you, Susan, for moderating and for your leadership. And thanks to Peter, who's the best colleague I could possibly imagine having.
Likewise.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Enjoy the meeting.